Let's take a moment and go back in time to World War I, 1916. You're a German soldier fighting in the Battle of the Somme. You've been there for months now, and casualty after casualty and day after day, the fighting continues with neither side really gaining any territory on each other. See, this is trench warfare, and you're not going anywhere anytime soon. But you're a simple person. You come from a small German town, farming community, where the most advanced thing you've ever seen in your life is a train. You've read in the paper about these new fancy automobiles that are taking over the world, but you've never seen one. Well, on September the 15th, you awake to a loud roaring noise, as well as the screams of all of your comrades to get up and get online. You grab your rifle and your helmet, and you storm out of your dugout to get on the trench line. You peek over the trench parapet, and you see what appears to be a giant metal animal crawling its way towards you across the battlefield, firing cannons that are mounted on both sides of it. You begin to fire your rifle at this monstrosity along with all of your comrades shooting machine guns at it. And you're watching as all of the bullets that you're shooting at this thing just bounce right off of it. This giant metal demon just continues to creep its way across the battlefield towards you, crushing dead bodies, mangling up barbed wire, and crossing all of the holes that are in the ground, seemingly unfazed by any of it as it continues to inch its way towards you. You begin to pray to whatever God you believe in to stop whatever this creature is that's coming towards you. But to no avail, it's still coming. And there's nothing that you have that will ever stop it. You see, this is the terror that thousands of men in World War I experienced that day, as well as terror that thousands of men will experience in years to come. See, for the first time ever, you are face to face with a tank. We're talking about tanks today. Welcome back to the Average Guy Explains YouTube channel, your one-stop place for all the knowledge in the world that you did not need, taught to you by a guy who's definitely not qualified to teach you about it. Tanks. It's a term and a word known to everyone. It brings up imagery of these giant armored fighting vehicles just charging across the battlefield, crushing everything in its way with seemingly very few ways to stop them. But to the uninitiated, you may be asking yourself, what is a tank, or why are tanks so important? Well, today we're going to learn about tanks. So grab a chair, grab a drink, sit back, and maybe I'll teach you something about them. The history and the idea of the tank is really an old concept. You see, the idea of a tank really boils down to a few factors. It's the idea of protecting infantry and rapid mobility of troops. Now, you see, the first, for what we'll call practical idea of a tank, was designed by our good friend Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci designed an infantry fighting vehicle that kind of looked like a wooden spinning top again, but it did not spin. It was designed to fit infantry inside of it. They had a way to drive it using wheels out onto a battlefield, and it had guns mounted to it. It was fully armored and would protect the men on the inside from small arms, arrows, pretty much any conventional firepower that would be used against it. But alas, like most of Da Vinci's ideas, it was never built because, once again, material science at the time would not allow for such a crazy invention to be made. But this is a concept that would come back later in history. In the early 1900s, with the advent of the Caterpillar track system, many people began to come up with designs for tracked armored fighting vehicles. An Austrian army engineer by the name of Gunther Burstein come up with a design which most people consider to be the first modern tank design. Burstein designed a 3-man tracked fighting vehicle with a movable turret, and he submitted this to the government. It was called the Burstein Motorgeschütz, or the motor gun vehicle. This design was rejected, and similar designs came up and were submitted to various governments throughout the world, and nobody really seemed interested in this. I mean, after all, it's the early 1900s. We are gentlemen, and we fight wars like gentlemen. I mean, it's not like there's going to be some global conflict that's just around the corner that's going to involve pretty much every single developed nation in the world and cause over 30 million casualties as it takes 4 years to come to a conclusion. Surprise, I lied. There was going to be a global conflict. And that global conflict was called World War I. You see, World War I was one of, if not the most brutal war ever fought in human history. The reason being that prior to World War I, wars were fought with Napoleonic warfare tactics, and this was the gentleman's way to wage war. Infantry approached in line formations, they did cavalry charges. It was just the way people fought wars. But you see, in the European theater of World War I, this was going to stop because there were two inventions that were invented prior to World War I that would ensure that we remove the gentleman aspect of gentleman's warfare. And those two inventions would be machine guns and barbed wire. Both of these basically grounded advances to a screaming halt. Armies could no longer advance, and this led to people digging in and creating their trenches just to protect themselves. Forward momentum was almost impossible, and if you wanted to do a massive breakthrough of the enemy lines, you were going to sustain heavy casualties. You see, when troops went to go cross the land between the trenches, also known as no man's land, they had to deal with crossing over barbed wire, landmines, all while still being shot at by machine guns that the other armies had. I mean, imagine being told you and a couple hundred of your buddies are going to go stand up and go charge across a 200-yard field that is riddled with craters from artillery, barbed wire fences that you can't get over, and you're being shot at by a couple dozen machine guns that the other side have. I mean, entire armies were being decimated in days, and no one was actually gaining any land. This stalemate forced the British to revisit an idea that they had denied prior to the war. And upon revisiting this idea, they decided this was going to be the way that they were going to break this stalemate. Because you see, the British were going to build a tank. Fun fact, the word tank actually comes from the British government's attempt to disguise and hide what they were building. You see, the British knew there were spies everywhere, and they were sure they had spies in their own government as well. So in order for this new wonder weapon that they were building to not be discovered, they hid the project under the guise that it was to develop a new water tank system. You see, imagine you're a German spy creeping around the British government building looking for top secret documents. Well, you would totally open the folder that says new, ultimate, cool, epic, armored vehicle that's going to win the war for us. You would definitely look in that folder, but you'd probably gloss over the folder labeled new water storage system. So that's what the British did, and to this day, that's why we call these giant armored fighting vehicles tanks. In 1915, the British Land Ship Committee, founded by Winston Churchill, maybe you've heard of him, designed and developed the first actual modern tank, also known as Little Willie. Now, Little Willie was never actually used in warfare, but it laid the groundwork for what would later become the first actual combat tank, and that would be the British Mark I tank. You see, the Mark I tank had a lot of ideas that were thrown at it, and it had to meet a few standards laid out. It had to move at the speed of a marching soldier. It had to be able to sustain small arms fire from machine guns and rifles, and it had to be able to cross over a trench. These Mark I tanks were not perfect by any means, but hey, when you have the only tank in the world, it is by default the best tank in the world. Now, throughout the war, there would be multiple variations of these Mark series tanks, the Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV, and so on. There would be male and female variants, the males having giant cannons on them and the females having machine guns on them. Hey, that's what they're called. I didn't say that. Now, these tanks were not the amazing wonder weapon that they were designed to be. Most of the time, they broke down before they ever actually made it to the other side's trench, and they dumped the exhaust on the inside of the vehicle, so the crews were constantly suffering from poison carbon monoxide. But their psychological impact was groundbreaking. I mean, no one had ever seen something like this. And throughout the war, the tanks were getting refined and refined, and by the end of the war, every single nation was building tanks. Fun fact, the first actual tank versus tank battle occurred in World War I. This happened on April the 24th, 1918, when during an assault, 3 German A-7V tanks just happened to stumble upon 3 British tanks. This was an unintentional meeting, as neither side knew the other side was there, but all of the tanks began to fire at each other. The British were able to defeat the Germans that day, sustaining the first tank battle victory ever, but no one actually planned for this. Some of the British tanks were the female variants we talked about, which didn't even have cannons on them, so it just happened to be that day that this happened. But going forward, they would ensure that this unpreparedness to fight other tanks would never happen again. With the ending of World War I, the Great Tank Race had begun, and every nation began developing new, better tanks. See, tanks now needed to have a rotating turret. They needed to be fast and mobile and tough. They needed to be able to fight other tanks. This is really when tanks begin to look like modern-day tanks. But once again, most nations didn't take this too seriously because, hey, we just got done fighting the Great War, the war to end all wars. Surely we won't need these things because there's not going to be another great European conflict involving almost every single nation once again that's going to cause even more casualties than the last war and be almost exclusively fought by mechanized infantry with a heavy emphasis on armored fighting vehicles. But you see, Germany, who lost World War I, knew that this was going to happen, and they began to rapidly modernize their tank fleet and began building and amassing large numbers of tanks because, see, Germany was getting ready for the rematch of the century, World War II. World War II began with a bang as German tanks stormed across mainland Europe, and the German army took all of mainland Europe pretty much in a matter of months. See, the German army was using what's called blitzkrieg tactics, which are believed to have been developed by a British army officer by the name of Sir Percy Hobart. Now, the Fat Electrician already has a video on Sir Percy Hobart, so I'm not going to spend too much time on him. It's a great video. You should check it out on his page, but I digress. The German tanks were light and fast and nimble, and they were using them in a way that nobody had ever really used tanks before. The speed of their tanks really caused every other nation to start taking notice, and then every other nation began trying to develop their fast, light tank because they needed to compete with the German tanks. And boy, oh boy, compete they did. World War II saw tanks of all shapes and sizes being developed throughout the war, as it was really the Great Tank War. And a lot of thought was put into their usage. Now, you see, you could break tanks down into really 3 categories. You had light tanks, medium tanks, and heavy tanks. See, Germany began the war using primarily their original Panzer tanks, which were light and fast. And prior to World War II, anti-tank infantry weapons didn't really exist. I mean, they had stuff, but nothing like modern-day bazookas and rocket launchers that armies developed. So these tanks were excellent. But as the war went on, infantry were getting weapons that could knock these light tanks out of the water. So tanks needed to get a little heavier. So the German army eventually began to build their Panzer IV and Panther tanks, and even their feared heavy tank, the Tiger tank. But see, Germany went with a quality over quantity approach, and they built approximately 8,000 Panzers, 6,000 Panthers, and about 1,300 Tiger tanks in total. Now, America, on the other hand, went with the let's mass produce the crap out of these things approach. And America went in with a light tank known as the M4 Sherman. And America built over 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks. They weren't the best tank in the world, but there's a lot of them. So, like a swarm of mosquitoes, the idea was you can't kill everybody, so let's just all rush in at once. Now, see, the Soviets went with a medium tank, and they developed, which in my opinion, the best tank of World War II, and that'd be the T-34 tank. And the T-34 was a medium tank, and the Soviets built over 80,000 of the T-34s. Now, mind you, America had other tanks as well, and Russia also had other tanks as well, but the German army was severely outnumbered on the tank front. In total, throughout the entire war, Germany only made about 25,000 total tanks. So, surprise, Germany lost the war. Fun fact, the T-34 Soviet main battle tank had something on it that no one had really used on an armored vehicle before, but is a mainstay in armored vehicles today, and that was sloped armor. Now you see, sloped armor is important because it, as the name suggests, takes the armor and slopes it. This allows for incoming rounds to hit it and have a chance of ricocheting off, as well as if you take a piece of steel that's normally standing right way up and you just slope it backwards, you actually have created more armor for a round to pass through just by making it at a slight angle. So you could have more armor for really no extra weight. And after World War II, pretty much every other tank in the world said, hey, that's a really cool idea, let's steal that. And everyone else started doing it. So, hey, sloped armor. With the end of World War II, tanks have seen usage in every single conflict since then, but by nowhere near the degree that they were used in World War II. Tanks have seen usage in Korea, Vietnam, wars in the Middle East, but tank-on-tank fighting isn't really a thing that happens anymore. Tanks are merely infantry support, more or less these days. The last great tank battle occurred in the Gulf War. It was a battle called the Battle of 73 Easting, when a detachment of U.S. Abrams tanks single-handedly destroyed every single Iraqi army tank in one day. Now, since then, tanks have pretty much been seen as these behemoths of the battlefield that just charge their way through with really no good, effective way to stop them. That is, of course, until the modern-day conflict in Ukraine, where tanks have learned that they are not invincible. The modern-day war in Ukraine has seen the modern battle tank really getting beat on a lot. You see, since the invention of the tank, anti-tank weapons have been developed just as much as the tanks themselves. And Russia has sent a ton of tanks into Ukraine, and those tanks have all pretty much been destroyed the second they get seen. You see, anti-tank weapons are pretty good nowadays, and then you've got these things called hunter-killer drones, which is basically like a RC car anti-tank weapon, except it flies. So imagine they take a drone, strap an anti-tank missile to it, and fly it kamikaze style into the tank, blowing the tank up. Now you see, with the modern day battle tank costing anywhere from $3 to $4 million per tank, and these anti-tank drones costing anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to have one big enough that it can knock a tank out, the cost to kill ratio for these drones is pretty cheap. Now, modern tanks are still no slouch, and they're actively working on deterrents that can stop these drones and other weapons from destroying them. So they're by no means a antiquated piece of war tech, but they're not the invincible behemoths that they used to be. And sure, while tanks are currently getting beat up on in the Ukraine-Russian war, the technology will catch up to defeat these anti-tank drones. It's just a matter of time. Armored fighting vehicles are still the best way to transport troops across battlefields, and tanks aren't going anywhere anytime soon. We just have to step back and rethink how we're using them effectively. But you see, the tank itself is more of a symbol nowadays. You see, we use the term tank to describe things that have nothing to do with what a traditional tank is. I mean, you see tanks in video games, you see them on TV and in movies, and they're always viewed as this, like the ultimate boss fight. It's this giant colossus thing that, you can't stop because it just continues to take abuse and keeps going. It's this unstoppable behemoth of a vehicle. I mean, we even use the word tank to describe things that aren't tanks. I've heard people personally, you see like a really large man and people are like, oh, that dude's a tank. Or when a football player is charging down the field, just knocking everybody out of his way, like, man, he's just, tanking through those people or tanking damage. Or, I mean, the video game Left 4 Dead, there's an enemy in that game. It's a gigantic mutant monster thing, and it's literally called the Tank because it just takes abuse and keeps on coming. So I don't think tanks are going anywhere anytime soon, and for now, they're still one of the coolest vehicles ever made, and they will continue to appear in war as well as media, modern culture, video games, everywhere. It's the tank, and it ain't going anywhere anytime soon. But I believe it's going to wrap up today's video on the tank. I hope you learned something about how this vehicle was created out of necessity and has been transformed into a modern symbol of unstoppable force. So, if you did learn something, give me a like on the video, leave me a comment, let me know what you think. Have you ever seen a tank in person? You ever driven a tank before? Do you know what the tank from Left 4 Dead is? Let me know. As usual, I'd like to thank every single person who watches these videos and takes time out of their day. I enjoy making them. I apologize that there's been a little bit of a delay in my uploading schedule. Hey, Christmas, New Year's. I'm a married man. I have a full-time job. So, and it's not really an excuse, but it's the excuse I got. So it's the excuse you're going to get. So I look forward to the next video. And until then, take care.